Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
The True History of Anthony Ffryar by Arthur Gray. The world, it is said, knows nothing of its greatest men. In our Cambridge microcosm, it may be doubted whether we are better informed concerning some of the departed great ones who once walked the confines of our colleges. Which of us has heard of Anthony Ffryar of Jesus? History is dumb respecting him. Yet, but for the unhappy event recorded in this unadorned chronicle, his fame might have stood with that of Bacon of Trinity or Harvey of Caius. They lived to be old men. Ffryar died before he was 30, his work unfinished, his fame unknown even to his contemporaries. So meagre is the record of his life's work that it is contained in a few bare notices in the college bursar's books, in the grace books, which date his matriculation and degrees, and in the entry of his burial in the register of All Saints' Parish. These simple annals I have ventured to supplement with details of a more or less hypothetical character, which will serve to show what humanity lost by his early death. Readers will be able to judge for themselves the degree of care which I have taken not to import into the story anything which may savour of the improbable or romantic. Anthony Ffryar matriculated in the year 1541 too, his age being then probably 15 or 16. He took his B.A. degree in 1545, his M.A. in 1548. He became a fellow about the end of 1547 and died in the summer of 1551. Such are the documentary facts relating to him. Dr. Reston was master of the college during the whole of his tenure of a fellowship and died in the same year as Ffryar. The chamber which Ffryar occupied as a fellow was on the first floor of the staircase at the west end of the chapel. The staircase has since been absorbed into the master's lodge, but the doorway through which it was approached from the cloister may still be seen. At the time when Ffryar lived there, the nave of the chapel was used as a parish church, and his windows overlooked the graveyard then called Jesus Churchyard, which is now a part of the master's garden. Ffryar was, of course, a priest, as were nearly all of the fellows in his day, but I do not gather that he was a theologian or complied more than formally with the obligation of his orders. He came to Cambridge when the 6 Articles and the suppression of the monasteries were of fresh and burning import. He became a fellow in the harsh Protestant days of Protector Somerset, and in all his time the master and the fellows were in scarcely disavowed sympathy with the rites and beliefs of the old religion. Yet in the battle of creeds I imagine that he took no part and no interest. I should suppose that he was a somewhat solitary man, an insatiable student of nature, and that his sympathies with humanity were starved by his absorption in the new science which dawned on Cambridge at the Reformation. When I say that he was an alchemist, do not suppose that in the middle of the 16th century the name of alchemy carried with it any associations of credulity or imposture. It was a real science and a subject of university study there, as its godchildren, physics and chemistry, are now. If the aims of its professors were transcendental, its methods were genuinely based on research. Ffryar was no visionary, but a man of sense, hard and practical. To the study of alchemy he was drawn by no hopes of gain, not even of fame, and still less by any desire to benefit mankind. He was actuated solely by an unquenchable passion for inquiry, a passion sterilizing to all other feeling. To the somnambulisms of the less scientific disciples of his school, such as the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life, he showed himself a chill agnostic. All his thoughts and energies were concentrated on the discovery of the magisterium, the master cure of all human ailments. For 4 years in his laboratory in the cloister he had toiled at his pursuit. More than once, when it had seemed most near, it had eluded his grasp. More than once he had been tempted to abandon it as a mystery insoluble. In the summer of 1551, the discovery waited at his door. He was certain of success, which only experiment could prove. And with the certainty arose a new passion in his heart, to make the name of Ffryar glorious in the healing profession as that of Galen or Hippocrates. In a few days, even within a few hours, the fame of his discovery would go out into all the world. The summer of 1551 was a sad time in Cambridge. It was marked by a more than usually fatal outbreak of the epidemic called the sweat, when, as Fuller says, patients ended or mended in 24 hours. It had smouldered some time in the town before it appeared with sudden and dreadful violence in Jesus College. The first to go was little Gregory Grange, schoolboy and chorister, who was lodged in the college school in the outer court. He was barely 13 years old, and known by sight to Anthony Ffryar. He died on July 31st, and was buried the same day in Jesus' churchyard. A service for his burial was held in the chapel, and at night, as was customary in those days. Funerals in college were no uncommon events in the 16th century, but in the death of the poor child, among strangers, there was something to move even the cold heart of Ffryar, and not the pity of it only impressed him. The dim chapel, the master and fellows obscurely arranged in their stalls and shrouded in their hoods, the long-drawn miserable chanting, and the childish trebles of the boys who had been Gregory's fellows struck a chill into him, which was not to be shaken off. 3 days passed, and another chorister died. The college gates were barred and guarded, and, except by a selected messenger, communication with the town was cut off. The precaution was unavailing, and the boys' usher, Mr. Stevenson, died on August the 5th. One of the junior fellows, Sustainer, Sir being the equivalent of B.A., followed on August the 7th. The master, Dr. Reston, died the next day. A gaunt, severe man was Dr. Reston, whom his fellows feared. The death of a Master of Arts on August 9th for a time completed the melancholy list. Before this, the frightened fellows had taken action. The scholars were dismissed to their homes on August 6th. Some of the fellows abandoned the college at the same time. The rest, a terrified conclave, met on August the 8th and decreed that the college should be closed until the pestilence should have abated. Until that time, it was to be occupied by a certain Robert Laycock, who was a college servant, and his only communication with the outside world was to be through his son, who lived in Jesus Lane. The decree was perhaps the result of the master's death, for he was not present at the meeting. Goodman Laycock, as he was commonly called, might have been the sole tenant of the college, but for the unalterable decision of Ffryar to remain there. At all hazards, his research, now on the eve of realization, must proceed. Without the aid of his laboratory at college, it would miserably hang fire. Besides, he had an absolute assurance of his own immunity, if the experiment answered his confident expectations, and his fancy was elated with the thought of standing like another Aaron between the living and the dead, and staying the pestilence with the potent magisterium. Until then, he would bar his door even against Laycock, and his supplies of food should be left on the staircase landing. Solitude for him was neither unfamiliar nor terrible. So, for 3 days, Ffryar and Laycock inhabited the cloister, solitary and separate. For 3 days, in the absorption of his research, Ffryar forgot fear, forgot the pestilence-stricken world beyond the gate, almost forgot to consume the daily dole of food laid outside his door. August the 12th was the day so fateful to humanity, when his labours were to be crowned with victory. Before midnight, the secret of the magisterium would be solved. Evening began to close in before he could begin the experiment which was to be his last. It must of necessity be a labour of some hours, and, before it began, he bethought him that he had not tasted food since early morning. He unbarred his door and looked for the expected portion. It was not there. Vexed at the remissness of Laycock, he waited for a while and listened for his approaching footsteps. At last he took courage and descended to the cloister. He called for Laycock, but heard no response. He resolved to go as far as the buttery door and knock. Laycock lived and slept in the buttery. At the buttery door he beat and cried on Laycock, but in answer he heard only the sound of scurrying rats. He went to the window by the hatch where he knew that the old man's bed lay, and called to him again. Still there was silence. At last he resolved to force himself through the unglazed window and take what food he could find. In the deep gloom within he stumbled and almost fell over a low object, which he made out to be a truckle bed. There was light enough from the window to distinguish, stretched upon it, the form of Goodman Laycock, stark and dead. Sickened and alarmed, Ffryar hurried back to his chamber. More than ever he must hasten the great experiment. When it was ended, his danger would be past, and he could go out into the town to call the buriers for the old man. With trembling hands he lit the brazier which he used for his experiments, laid it on his hearth, and placed thereon the alembic which was to distill the magisterium. Then he sat down to wait. Gradually the darkness thickened, and the sole illuminant of the chamber was the wavering flame of the brazier. He felt feverish and possessed with a nameless uneasiness, which, for all his assurance, he was glad to construe as fear. Better that than sickness. In the college and the town without was a deathly silence, stirred only by the sweltering of the distilment, and, as the hours struck, by the beating of the chapel clock, last wound by Laycock, it was as though the dead man spoke. But the repetition of the hours told him that the time of his emancipation was drawing close. Whether he slept, I do not know. He was aroused to vivid consciousness by the clock sounding 1. The time when his experiment should have ended was 10, and he started up with a horrible fear that it had been ruined by his neglect. But it was not so. The fire burnt, the liquid simmered quietly, and so far all was well. Again the college bell boomed a solitary stroke, then a pause, and then another. He opened, or seemed to open, his door and listened. Again the knell was repeated. His mind went back to the night when he had attended the obsequies of the boy chorister. This must be a funeral tolling. For whom? He thought with a shudder of the dead man in the buttery. He groped his way cautiously down the stairs. It was a still windless night, and the cloister was dark as death. Arrived at the further side of the court, he turned towards the chapel. Its panes were faintly lighted from within. The door stood open, and he entered. In the place familiar to him at the chancel door, one candle flickered on a bracket. Close to it, his face cast in deep shade by the light from behind, stood the ringer, in a gown of black, silent and absorbed in his melancholy task. Fear had almost given way to wonder in the heart of Ffryar, and as he passed the sombre figure on his way to the chancel door, he looked him resolutely in the face. The ringer was Goodman Laycock. Ffryar passed into the choir and quietly made his way to his accustomed stall. 4 candles burnt in the central walk about a figure laid on trestles and draped in a pall of black. 2 choristers, one on either side, stood by it. In the dimness he could distinguish 4 figures erect in the stalls on either side of the chapel. Their faces were concealed by their hoods, but in the tall form, which occupied the master's seat, it was not difficult to recognize Dr. Reston. The bell ceased, and the service began. With some faint wonder, Ffryar noted that it was the prescribed Roman Mass for the dead. The solemn introit was uttered in the tones of Reston, and in the deep responses of the nearest cowled figure he recognized the voice of Stevenson, the usher. None of the mourners seemed to notice Ffryar's presence. The dreary ceremony drew to a close. The 4 occupants of the stalls descended and gathered round the palled figure in the aisle. With a mechanical impulse devoid of fear or curiosity, and with a half prescience of what he should see, Anthony Ffryar drew near and uncovered the dead man's face. He saw himself. At the same moment, the last wailing notes of the office for the dead broke from the band of mourners, and one by one the choristers extinguished the 4 tapers. Requiem aeternam dona e Domine, chanted the hooded 4, and 1 candle went out. Et lux perpetua luceat, was the shrill response of the 2 choristers, and the 2nd was extinguished. Cum sanctis tuis in aeternum, answered the 4, and 1 taper only remained. The master threw back his hood and turned his dreadful eyes straight upon the living Anthony Ffryar. He threw his hand across the bier and held him tight. "Cras tu eris mecum," he muttered, as if in antiphonal reply to the dirge chanters. The hiss and the sputter and a sudden sense of gloom recalled Ffryar to the waking world. Alas for labouring science! Alas for the fame of Ffryar! Alas for humanity, dying and doomed to die! The vessel containing the wonderful brew which should have redeemed the world had fallen over and dislodged its contents on the fire below. An accident repairable surely within a few hours, but not by Anthony Ffryar. How the night passed with him no mortal can tell. All that is known further of him is written in the register of All Saints' Parish. If you can discover the ancient volume containing the records of the year 1551, I am not positive that it now exists, you will find it written Die Augusti Tridecim. Burials in Jesus Churchyard. Goodman Laycock, Anthony Ffryar of the sickness. Whether he really died of the sweat, I cannot say, but that the living man was sung to his grave by the dead who were his sole companions in Jesus College on the night of August 12, 1551, is as certain and indisputable as any other of the facts which I here set forth in the history of Anthony Ffryar. Tony Walker note: the Latin comment "cras tu eris mecum" is from Samuel, Vulgate Bible, Samuel 27 verse 19, and it means tomorrow you will be with me. If you like that story, consider supporting me as a patron. That way you help me make more stories for you and get access to a patrons-only library of stories. Lots more hours for you to listen to.
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret of the dead come back?
So that was The True History of Anthony Ffryar, with 2 Fs, written by Arthur Gray. And as is my habit, I will tell you first about Arthur Gray, the author. So he was born in 1852, 28th of September, as it turns out, in the waning years of Victorian expansion, at least in the UK, into a world whose outward confidence masked deepening anxieties about faith, time and empire. Though he would live to the age of 87, dying in Cambridge on 12th of April 1940, as Europe once again turned to war, his fiction is steeped in a very different kind of unease, one born not of geopolitics but of memory, decay and the impermanence of intellectual striving. So Gray was educated at Blackheath Preparatory School before going up to Jesus College, Cambridge. He remained there quite literally for the rest of his life. Elected a Fellow of Jesus in 1875, he served in various administrative posts, junior proctor, senior tutor, vice master, before being appointed master in 1912, a role he would retain until his death. He died in the Master's Lodge itself, a stone's throw from the chapel and cloisters he'd fictionalised so effectively in his stories. He and his wife, Alice Honora Gell, born 1857, whom he married in 1882, had 6 sons. Alice predeceased him in 1927, so he lived a fair while after her. Gray was, by all appearances, a model of a Cambridge don. He published on Shakespeare, edited local ecclesiastical statutes, and produced a sequence of studies on the early history of Jesus College and Cambridge at large. His bibliography includes titles such as Cambridge and Its Story, published 1912, Shakespeare's Son-in-Law, 1939, and The History of Jesus College, Cambridge. These are works of sober antiquarian interest, well-researched and modest in ambition, serving to consolidate institutional memory rather than to provoke. Yet, in 1919, a very different volume emerged under the pseudonym Ingulphus, called Tedious Brief Tales of Granta and Gramarye, published by W. Heffer Sons of Cambridge. The tales had been appearing for nearly a decade in college magazines and the Cambridge Review, but their quiet assembly into a single collection was done without fanfare. Only the addition of Gray's name in parentheses on the title page outed, or doxed as we would say these days, the Master of Jesus College as their author. The illustrations by E. Joyce Shillington Scales, then aged around 22, lent the book an atmosphere that was both collegiate and uncanny. The stories are set in a fictionalized Cambridge, steeped in ecclesiastical shadows and antiquarian dust. They draw from the same well as M.R. James, Gray's contemporary and near-exact peer in terms of background and temperament, but differ in tone. Where James delivers sudden shocks and elemental dread, Gray writes with a kind of melancholic fatalism. His ghosts emerge less from the cursed objects than from forgotten duties and abandoned places. The most memorable tales, The True History of Anthony Ffryar and The Burden of Dead Books, linger on themes of solitude, scholarly overreach, and the quiet horror of being erased by time. They are elegies in ghost story form. Gray's fiction is technically modest but tonally distinct. The settings are drawn from his daily environment, cloisters, chapels, buttery doors, and yet they serve as metaphors for spiritual stasis and human incompleteness. There are no happy endings. If salvation is possible, it is always lost at the last minute through accident, fear, or the inevitable extinguishing of the final taper. In 1917, Gray co-founded the Order of the Red Rose with the zoologist George Percival Mudge and the barrister William John Sanderson. This organisation, explicitly anti-Semitic and hostile to finance capitalism, sits uneasily in the legacy of a man otherwise remembered for his literary refinement and ecclesiastical reserve. Its formation during the First World War and the aftermath of revolutionary unrest reflects the darker currents of British institutional conservatism, a milieu in which fears of decline often masked latent prejudice. We see this a lot in Victorian literature particularly. Gray's literary influences are not hard to trace. Like M.R. James, he draws from the Gothic revival, medieval, that is the Gothic literary revival, but also the Gothic architectural revival of the mid-19th century. He's interested in theology. The atmosphere of his fiction owes something to Edgar Allan Poe and Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, but is ultimately anchored in English ecclesiastical history. His tales are marked by a tone of reflective understatement, often bordering on the funereal. If M.R. James's horrors arrive like a cold hand in the dark, Gray's seep in like rising damp. Though never widely known, Gray's stories have enjoyed periodic revivals. In 1993, Ghost Story Press reissued the collection with one additional story, Suggestion, first published in 1925. In 1996, Jesus College released its own edition for the quincentenary of its founding. In 2008, Ash Tree Press published a further limited edition, affirming Gray's place in the secondary canon of English supernatural fiction. Gray did not write for sensation, and he left no heirs in the popular sense, but he occupies a peculiar niche, a scholar who turned to fiction not to escape history, but to mourn it. His stories are quiet reckonings with what survives us and what does not. Anyway, let's talk about this particular story. The True History of Anthony Ffryar was published in this in the collection Tedious Brief Tales of Granta and Gramarye, we've just talked about. It was issued in 1919, published in Cambridge, and initially used the pseudonym Ingulphus, but it was identified. There was no real attempt to disguise his name, and he was identified as Master of Jesus College. He would have been well known in Cambridge. The True History of Anthony Ffryar gains much of its atmosphere and narrative weight from its setting in mid-16th century Jesus College, Cambridge, of which he was master later. To fully, a couple of centuries later, to fully appreciate the story, readers should understand that Cambridge is not a single unified university. You might not know this, but this is the truth. But a federation of individual colleges, like Oxford, each with its own buildings, governance and traditions. Jesus College was founded in 1496 on the site of the medieval priory of St Radegund. It retains visible traces of its monastic origins. Cloisters, chapels and graveyards coexist with the routines of scholarship, producing a setting steeped in historical sediment. Gray uses this layered physical and spiritual architecture not merely as a background, but as a crucible in which the story's moral and metaphysical drama unfolds. The story's central character, Anthony Ffryar, is a fellow of the college, a position that in the 16th century entailed celibacy, ordination and residence within the college precincts. Fellows were academic clergy, so they were priests, engaged in teaching, prayer and research, bound to the rhythms of chapel and hall. Above them stood the master, a figure of institutional and moral authority who governed both the academic and spiritual life of the college. This story draws power from its internal hierarchy, suggesting a world in which intellectual ambition and spiritual obligation sit in uneasy tension. Ffryar's increasing detachment from human contact, his withdrawal into solitary research and his final descent into obsession are all framed by the architecture and ethos of this closed, male, monastic society. The historical moment in which it occurs is also crucial. So Ffryar's life coincides with the English Reformation, a period of violent religious transformation. The dissolution of the monasteries, the enforcement of the 6 Articles and the radical shifts in liturgy and doctrine left Cambridge intellectually energized but spiritually destabilized. Jesus College, with its recent monastic past and conservative leanings, would have been a place of quiet resistance to some of these things. Remember, it's the Roman Mass that's heard, or the Roman service that's heard in Latin. Of course, so Protestants typically favoured the vernacular languages rather than Latin. So Ffryar is presented as apolitical, indifferent to creed, and consumed instead by the emerging sciences. His alchemical work is not portrayed as superstition, so he's not interested in the philosopher's stone and all the other stuff and eternal life, but as a rigorous proto-science. He seeks the magisterium, or the magisterium in Church Latin, the universal cure. In the context of the Reformation, this pursuit is laden with symbolic as well as scientific ambition. He is reaching not only for bodily healing but for metaphysical mastery. And at this time, the outbreak of the plague, the so-called sweat, provides an immediate narrative crisis. It's historically accurate, and this detail introduces a sudden and absolute disruption. The college gates are closed. Reminds you of COVID times, really. It must have been very common for our ancestors, where it's become uncommon for us. But even up until the 1918 flu, Western societies were racked with plagues. So we forget that. And then, of course, we had one. Let's not talk about that. That was a very traumatic time in lots of ways. Only Ffryar remains yet in the college with a single servant to pursue his experiment in isolation. His decision is framed as both heroic and pathological. He does believe that his discovery will save humanity, yet he separates himself entirely from human company to achieve it. That's very interesting, isn't it? And I think that may not be unique amongst people who have this particular kind of mindset. They're going to pursue their discovery to benefit humanity, but that means they're kind of separate from ordinary people. So the college, when it's closed up, normally a site of shared liturgy and communal learning, becomes instead a tomb, empty, echoing and under quarantine. It's within this sealed environment that Ffryar experiences the ghostly funeral rite in which he sees his own death enacted by the spirits of the recently deceased. Makes you think of Dickens, doesn't it? Christmas Carol, when he sees himself there. I was thinking of another, often when I'm doing these things, books and references jump into my mind, and if I don't say them straight away, and I'm trying to stick to the text in this one, rather than go all over the place, I've just broken that rule now. But, and then I forget, and I think, I should have said that, and now I can't remember what it was. So it's okay. The ghostly vision is rooted in physical and spiritual geography of the college. The chapel, cloister, buttery and staircase are not generic settings, but specific elements of 16th century Cambridge architecture. He knew these places. used with precise attention to ritual and detail. The story's supernatural effect depends on grounded realism. The final extinguishing of the candles, the Latin requiem, and the appearance of the dead master, Dr. Reston, who was his predecessor, all gain power because they occur in a space the reader has come to recognise not only as haunted, but as historical. So Gray's tale is not simply a meditation on death and ambition. It's an invocation of a particular institutional world that he was massively attached to. He wrote a history of Jesus College, in which theology, mortality and memory are inseparably entangled. The story reveals the author's position, Arthur Gray, as a senior academic embedded in the cloistered world of Cambridge. It's not a tale constructed from secondary sources or general impressions of the past. He knows all of this. He knows the history, he knows the architecture, he knows the ritual. It's built from within, using the daily substance of college life, the arrangement of the staircases, the handling of plague protocols, the status of college servants, the administrative titles used in the 16th century. The room where Ffryar works, the cloister through which he walks, the buttery where he finds a dead man, they're not fabrications, they're drawn from the institutional memory of a man who had lived in those same buildings for decades and understood their spiritual and administrative logic. And Church Latin appears throughout the story without translation, so phrases from the Requiem Mass are presented in their liturgical form without comment. This choice reflects the author's assumption that the reader belongs, or ought to belong is important, to the same educated world in which Latin was part of daily academic and religious life. In a sense, M.R. James used to read his stories in the college and assume perhaps that his audience were people like him, and Arthur Gray goes even that step further. Not only are they like him, they are very like him. They are very familiar with Church Latin, for example, and ecclesiastical history. The Mass for the dead, the tolling of the bell, and the extinguishing of candles are described plainly without exposition. They're not Gothic flourishes added for effect. So I think what we're saying there is that, in many cases the Gothics wrote, and they would add bits like this, and they were there simply as props, as set dressing. In a sense, for Gray, this is a real story to him, and it's not added for a flourish, it's actually integral. This is as it is. It's really how it would have been. So who was he like? So you think immediately of M.R. James, but you also might think of Walter de la Mare. He's in the tradition of late Edwardian and interwar writers whose ghost stories emerge from classically educated scholarly milieu, but the sensibility differs markedly. So M.R. James is obvious. Like Gray, was a Cambridge don, a college administrator, and a scholar of ecclesiastical history. His stories often feature antiquarians, clergymen, and scholars in covering something best left buried. But James's prose is brisker, cooler, and more structured for narrative effect. He delights in pacing and the slow escalation of dread and the sudden arrival of the grotesque. His ghosts are tangible, they have physical effects, and usually malevolent. The terror lies in the incursion of something other. I've said that James deploys the weird. So, by contrast, Gray writes from the inside out. His ghost story is not about an encounter with the unknown, but about a man being quietly claimed by the world he never left. This is exactly the world that Ffryar knew. It is not weird. The only odd thing about it is the fact that it's his own funeral and it's being conducted by the recently dead, which is, okay, fair enough, supernatural. But there's nothing weird in it, there's no things that should not be in it. This is exactly what it should be. The fear in Gray's work is not of being pursued, as we see very much in James, but of being forgotten. So the great tragedy is that, and of course, Gray, whether he believed it or not, does not in the story at least cast doubt on the fact that the magisterium was truly created, that would have benefited all mankind and banished all kinds of illnesses like this. And he wasn't able to do it. He ran out of time. Yeah. So, and that must be, I don't know if this is his personal experience, but he lived a long time himself, but he must have seen, or at least feared, that he wouldn't live long enough to create and finish the work that he felt was important, whether that be the history of Jesus College or some ecclesiastical treatise or whatever. And I think that is a common thing amongst academics who are often consumed by a particular thesis, theory, hypothesis, project, and they're against time. Their life is measured in slow progress, but they're against time. I think perhaps different now in that it's all about publishing as much as you can. But there we are. So then we think about okay, that's why it's different to M.R. James. What about Walter de la Mare? So Walter de la Mare was not a Cambridge man, but he's concerned with memory, with dream, and the porous border between life and death. So de la Mare's stories, of which we've done a few, are more stylized and lyrical. He was a poet, often veering into the surreal or symbolist, very much so. Think of All Hallows, where Gray offers, whereas in All Hallows the cathedral there is symbolic in lots of ways. It feels like a dream cathedral, even though it's supposed to be a real one. But de la Mare, he can wander into dream, even though it's portrayed as life. Do you know what I mean? So his scenes are dreamlike. That's what I'm trying to say. Run out of words. So, and then we think of Robert Bridges, London Snow, great poem by the way. L.P. Hartley, we've done various of his, and Charles Williams, one of the Inklings. Charles Williams, of course, friend of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien's, or not necessarily a friend, but part of the Inklings group. I think he might have been a friend. I remember reading a biography of the Inklings at some point, but that was years ago. Charles Williams writes some very symbolist, modernist stuff, often supernatural or spiritual, but can be quite hard to read, much harder than Lewis or Tolkien. So, yeah. I mean, you may wonder whether Anthony Ffryar was actually a historical figure. He creates him. I think Lovecraft does this a bit, and he will produce documents that seem to be the support for the fact that this actually really happened. Such and such, certain date, certain place, certain person, and Gray does that as well. So, and of course, so does M.R. James. He was very much about fictitious antiquarian discoveries. We don't know is the answer. The records that he claims, he gives a bit of a hint at that, and at the end he says, well, the reader could look up, but it may be lost. Well, yeah, it is lost. So possibly I'm guessing he's completely fictional. Renton, I'm not sure. So let's talk about the Magisterium, if you don't know anything about alchemy. So it's the masterwork or perfected substance, the culmination of alchemical inquiry, often associated with the universal medicine capable of curing all diseases. Unlike the more fantastical philosopher's stone, which promises immortality in the transmutation of metals into gold, the Magisterium is more restrained and, in this context, more plausible. So he's very much a proto-scientist, not a mystic. He doesn't believe in the elixir of life, but his pursuit of the Magisterium is methodical, experimental, and emotionally sterile. So he's a scientist. In its historical form, it was never simply a precursor to modern chemistry, though it was treated as a proper science and a subject for study. By the 16th century, it had become a liminal position, neither wholly discredited or fully orthodox. The boundary at that time between science and occultism hadn't yet hardened, so we have scholars like the German Paracelsus was arguing for chemical medicine, drawing upon alchemical ideas but configuring towards empirical ends, so he's in many senses the father of modern pharmacology. In this context, Ffryar's pursuit of the Magisterium is plausible and historically grounded. He's not depicted as a magician or a dreamer, but as a serious researcher. Other people who were on this boundary at that time were John Dee, Paracelsus, of course, 1493, 1541, a physician, seeking the arcanum, the hidden essence in all matter. John Dee, very famous occultist, 1527, but also mathematician, philosopher, alchemist, died 1608, a Cambridge-educated mathematician and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. He had owned one of the largest libraries in England. He straddled the worlds of science and the occult. We have in the following century Robert Boyle, Boyle's Law, chemistry, 1627, 1691, one of the founders of modern chemistry. But he was an alchemist in beginning anyway. And he never abandoned the search for the philosopher's stone, and he believed in the possibility of transmutation, which of course is true. You can transmute atomically, you can transmute all metals. However, it's just ruinously expensive, so it makes the gold not worth what you've paid to transmute it. So but Boyle, his sceptical chemist, laid the groundwork for modern atomic theory. But he was continually interested in the preparation of alchemical medicines. Isaac Newton, born 1642, died 1727, gravity. But he spent more time in alchemy than optics or celestial mechanics. His alchemical manuscripts, once dismissed, are now understood as essential to his conception of force, causation, and divine order. He saw no contradiction between seeking the structure of the cosmos and searching for the vegetative spirit that animated matter. For him, alchemy was not superstition, it was the hidden architecture of the physical world, awaiting decipherment. And then if you think about this idea of a hidden force called gravity that attracts things, it's a deeply occult idea. A thought, what is that? Actually, what is it? Point it to me. Tell me what it is. Show me what it is. It's similar to animal attraction. It's similar to this idea of magic, that you can influence the world through will. It's similar. It's not the same, but it's similar. That there are powers that are invisible that work amongst us, around us. Anyway. So there we are. An interesting sort of story. I liked it. What did I like about it personally? I liked the drawing. I love it when Lovecraft does this and other people, and they use false documents or false references to create anyway, Borges does it a little bit as well, but he's obviously fantastical, so you don't believe it. Italo Calvino does it as well. But I like that. I like the closed world of this gloomy Gothic college. There's nobody in it. I like all that, and I like the Latin, and just it's a deeply Gothic story in lots of ways. In the sense of, we just said it wasn't a Gothic sensationalist story, which it isn't, but it is a bit Gothic, isn't it? So, and this fact that, oh goodness me, if he hadn't died of the sweats, which were a real thing as well, the sweating sickness. So all the facts are correct, as they would be with this man. I see this as Arthur Gray is a very meticulous researcher. I mean, he wasn't he? That was his job. So all of it's right, the sweats, and his description of the college, of course, which he would, his description of alchemy, which of course he knew. I liked it. And probably that's all I'm going to say for now. So I hope you enjoyed it too. Let me know if you did. I'm still working through my Uncanny Mirror project, so if you've got a story idea, it's a paid coaching service that looks at the symbolic nature of your story, what's it about, and then we can go through what's right about it, what's wrong with it. But if you're interested in that, drop me an email at classicghoststoriespodcast at gmail.com. So Classic Ghost Podcast, not Classic Ghost Stories, Classic Ghost Podcast at gmail.com. That's it. Anyway, but I hope you like the story. There will be more.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?